Welcome to the Blackwell Archives. The first known reference to the Rule of Saint Kelmor appears not in formal ecclesiastical doctrine, but in the margin of a land charter dated 1129, describing a tract of forested high ground in the northern borderlands. The marginal note is written in a different hand than the main document, smaller and more compressed, as though intended to escape attention. It reads only, Hoc loco regula sapita. In this place, the rule is kept. No saint by the name of Kelmor appears in any recognized hagiography of the period. There are no recorded miracles, no feast days, no iconography. His absence is notable given how frequently his name resurfaces in subsequent centuries, always briefly, always indirectly, always as something already understood. The abbey most commonly associated with these references was never formally founded. No papal bull authorizes its construction. No record of consecration survives. Instead, the structure seems to have emerged gradually, stone set upon stone without ceremony, as though completing an obligation rather than establishing a presence. Later, travelers describe the abbey not as built, but as finished, a term usually reserved for repairs or restorations. The site itself was long avoided. Even before Christian settlement, the ridge of dark limestone overlooking the valley was considered unsuitable for habitation. Fires burned weakly, sound behaved inconsistently, fading too quickly or returning after a delay that unsettled those who listened for it. Animals refused to remain overnight. When the first brothers arrived, they did not clear the land in the customary way. Trees were felled only where necessary, and several older growths were left standing within the outer walls, their roots threading through the foundations. Later architectural surveys would note that the internal layout of the abbey does not conform to monastic standards. Corridors terminate without purpose. Chapels are misaligned. Several stairways descend into solid stone. The brothers did not follow the rule of Saint Benedict or any recognized derivative. They followed the rule of Saint Kelmor, a document surviving only in fragments across 3 incomplete manuscripts housed in separate collections. Each manuscript omits different sections. Each agrees on one point only. The rule was not written to govern prayer or labor, but attention. The reconstructed prologue does not invoke divine authority. It offers a warning. Attend not as the world attends, it reads, for the world looks to use, and we look to endure. Daily life within the abbey outwardly resembled that of other monastic communities. The brothers rose before dawn, prayed, labored, ate in silence, yet visitors noted deviations, subtle enough to be unsettling rather than obvious. The hours of prayer shifted seasonally without regard for the liturgical calendar. Bells were rung irregularly, sometimes omitted entirely. On certain days the brothers gathered in the chapel and stood without speaking for extended periods. Heads bowed, eyes open, no altar stood at the chapel's center. Instead there was an empty stone dais worn smooth by centuries of contact. Contemporary accounts describe it as receiving the gaze, a phrase repeated often enough to suggest technical meaning rather than metaphor. The rule devotes considerable space to silence, carefully distinguishing it from quiet. Silence, it insists, is not the absence of sound but the refusal to answer it. Brothers were instructed never to respond immediately to speech, whether spoken by another monk or a visitor. Words were to be held internally and released only if necessary, and then briefly. Outsiders found this practice disquieting. One chronicler recounts an evening meal during which he was addressed repeatedly yet answered only after long delays, sometimes minutes later, sometimes only after the subject had already passed. More troubling were reports that the brothers appeared to know what would be asked before words were spoken. These accounts were dismissed as coincidence or devotional exaggeration. The abbey accepted novices rarely. When it did, the process was prompt. Prospective brothers were required to remain within the outer grounds for a full year before being allowed to take vows. During this time they were not instructed, they were observed. The rule specifies that a novice must demonstrate the ability to withhold response. Those who reacted reflexively to sound, movement, or inquiry were dismissed quietly and without explanation. Several dismissed novices later wrote of persistent unease, describing dreams in which they stood before a question they could not hear yet felt compelled to answer. The most controversial section of the rule concerns confession. Unlike other orders, the Brothers of Saint Kelmor did not confess sins. They confessed attention. Each week they were required to recount moments when their focus had wandered, when they had listened too closely, when they had responded internally to something that did not demand response. These confessions were not absolved. They were recorded. No such record survives, but repeated references to a liber custodia, the Book of Keeping, appear in inventories compiled after the abbey's dissolution. The first official inquiry occurred in 1284 following complaints from nearby villagers. Livestock vanished. Wells produced foul-tasting water. Several villagers reported hearing bells at night, though the abbey's bell tower was known to be in disrepair. The investigating bishop described the brothers as compliant and orthodox, courteous but reserved. He noted no heresy, yet recorded an unease he could not justify. "They look as though they are waiting," he wrote, "not for judgment, but for recognition." Minor reforms were ordered. The abbey complied. Nothing changed. Over subsequent decades, references to Saint Kelmor's rule appear beyond the abbey. A distant prior mentions adopting elements concerning silence, cautioning that its application requires care, lest the listener be mistaken for the speaker. The phrase is not explained. During the first wave of plague in 1347, the abbey closed its gates. No brother is recorded as falling ill. When the gates reopened 2 years later, travelers remarked that the brothers appeared unchanged, though the surrounding villages were largely abandoned. It is during this period that the inner chapel is first mentioned. Earlier plans show no such space, yet later accounts describe a small chamber beneath the main chapel, accessible by a concealed stair behind the dais. The inner chapel contained no furnishings, no altar, no candles. Brothers entered it alone and remained as long as they were able. The rule states that this is not a place of prayer but of withholding. What is withheld is never specified. The final years of the abbey are poorly documented. In 1421, a royal edict ordered the consolidation of smaller religious houses. St. Kelmor's Abbey was named, but inspectors reported the site unfit for habitation and recommended abandonment. When dissolution followed, only 9 brothers remained. They did not resist. They requested permission to remain until the rule was complete. Permission was denied. The brothers departed quietly. No record indicates where they went. Their names appear nowhere else. Within a generation, the abbey fell into ruin. Stone was taken for nearby buildings. The inner chapel was never found. Excavations suggest the substructure beneath the main chapel is denser than expected, as though intentionally filled. Local folklore attached itself to the site. Shepherds spoke of voices that ceased when acknowledged. Children reported that the ruins felt busy even when empty. The final known reference to the Rule of Saint Kelmor appears in a 17th century treatise on monastic errors, cited as an example of excessive inwardness. In the margin, written in a different hand, someone has added, "The rule was not meant to be read." Modern scholars debate whether Saint Kelmor existed at all. Some suggest the name derives from a pre-Christian term. Others argue the rule represents contemplative discipline taken beyond its limits. Excavations remain inconclusive. Sound recordings made on the site often contain unexplained delays. One researcher notes that when standing at the center of the ruined chapel, It is possible to hear one's own breathing twice. The surviving fragments of the rule end abruptly. There is no benediction. The final reconstructed line reads, "When the keeping is complete, the answer will no longer be required." What answer this refers to is unknown. The site remains unmarked. Most who find it do so by accident. They report nothing overtly unusual, only that it feels discourteous to speak.